welcome to the AM2R bonus video. Man, sure feels like it's been a while since I've even looked at this game. Wonder why that is. Oh. Well, that explains that, I guess. It's finally time to take a deep dive into everything I wanted to cover in this bonus video. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get started with a couple of things in the game I didn't show off in the main LP itself. When you reach the genetics laboratory, you can head to the right instead of up towards the main area, and this will lead you back to Area 2, from which you can backtrack all the way to Area 5, which gives you pretty quick access back to the rest of the game. This pipe was added in version 1.1 to make it easier to backtrack for 100%. And also, if you think you can just take this pipe to get here early and finish the game without clearing Area 5, sorry to tell you, that's not gonna happen. The tester boss in Area 4 has a pretty interesting quick kill method if you wait until you have power bombs to fight it. You can use your invincibility frames to shove Samus's arm cannon right through its barrier and onto its shield, and shoot down its energy field just without even having to fire any missiles. Once that's down, you just have to lay a power bomb and boom, the fight's pretty much over. In addition to the ending shown off in the LP, there are two other ending pictures, all three being drawn by Azima Khan, who also did the cover art for the soundtrack, the picture of SR388 seen in the intro, and more. These pictures are unlocked based entirely on your clear time, with your item percentage not mattering a damn bit. You can find links to high quality versions of these drawings and more work by the artist down in the video description. Interesting to note, more ending screens were planned with more complicated unlocking requirements, including various events from future games in the franchise, and I believe one of Samus playing the cello to reference her appearance in the NES version of Tetris. Though I can't offhand remember the source for that last particular concept. It was probably discussed in the developer livestream and I've just forgotten exactly where it comes up. The developer livestream itself has some pretty interesting tidbits that were discussed, so I'll definitely be putting a link to that in the video description. Speaking of planned content, let's talk about that next. A lot of stuff was planned to be added to AM2R in future releases after the initial 1.0 launch, and there are some pretty interesting things to talk about here that didn't make it into the game. By the way, all of this information comes from a forum post on the AM2R Tapatalk, so I'll link that in the description as well. Perhaps the most interesting of the planned features was a New Game Plus mode. In this, all the lava and rock formations blocking you from progressing before killing all the Metroids in an area would have been completely removed. The only blockade that would have been left is the final one leading out of the Omega's Nest to the genetics laboratory. Bomb or missile blocks that would have blocked you from entering an area would have also been removed just so you could tackle the areas in, theoretically, any order you wanted. In New Game Plus, a few new items would also have been added to the game, these being beam combos, which were a technique that could be used with power bombs in Super Metroid, and were introduced as a proper power-up in the Metroid Prime series. All of these beam combos would have only been able to be found in New Game Plus, and they would have been capable of damaging Metroids as well, giving players new ways to fight them off. Of course, none of this compares to one of the absolute coolest ideas to be cut from any video game ever. You ready? Okay, so, towards the end of development, with Metroid Prime Federation Force being a hot topic at the time, an idea was brought up involving a cutscene with the Federation troopers fighting against an Omega Metroid in one of their giant mech suits. Doc was actually pretty interested in this idea, and it could have even led to implementing a mech that Samus would have been able to pilot in the game. It's not explicitly stated what this would have been used for, but my money is definitely on it being used for a unique boss fight against one of the Omega Metroids. God, can you just imagine Samus piloting a giant mech, fighting a fucking Omega Metroid? I'm imagining it right now! And now I'm sad because it's not in the final game. Of course, gameplay wasn't the only thing that was planned to be added to in future updates. There was interest in expanding the lore of the game as well, in the form of additional log entries exploring some questions about how exactly the Metroids work, such as why they're only capable of evolving on SR388, the use of radiation to multiply the Metroids, and other such topics. There's also the possibility of adding logs providing additional background to the scientists and Federation soldiers. A Prime Hunters reference was also planned, although what it would have been exactly isn't clear. But it would have meant that AM2R would have contained references to every single game in the franchise, outside of Prime Pinball. Now, here's something that might sound a little familiar. An additional post-credits scene was planned that would have been a direct reference to Metroid Fusion. During the ending, when Samus takes the baby Metroid back to her ship, the Metroid has to eat through these green, crystal-like objects blocking the tunnels, so that Samus can actually escape. This ending scene would have involved revealing that the crystals were actually crystallized X-parasites, and would involve watching as a Hornode walks into the egg room and is possessed by an X-parasite and consumed. If this sounds familiar to you, that's because a cutscene extremely similar to this in concept was used as a post-credit stinger in Samus Returns. It's not note for note the same idea. There's no evidence suggesting that the crystals are the X-parasites for one thing, but the idea of using a Hornode as the unfortunate victim is still there, and there's absolutely no mistaking the yellow jelly monster as anything but an X-parasite. There's probably some debate to be had over whether or not this idea was taken from AM2R's planned content, but I honestly don't think this is too likely. I think it's just a coincidence. Hornodes are pretty iconic as far as Metroid Fusion is concerned, given that in the very opening cutscene you see an infected one in turn infect Samus, and the very first enemy you encounter in gameplay is an infected Hornode on the BSL station. Add into this that Mercury Steam was originally pitching an idea for a Metroid Fusion remake, it makes a lot of sense that they would want to throw in a reference to the game that they wanted to remake, especially considering the events of Metroid 2 directly tie in to the cause of Metroid Fusion. Alright, so speaking of the Metroids themselves, there's one more bit of unused lore. In the genetics laboratory, a hidden message was planned to be implemented, written in the Chozo language. This message would have been added to the logbook and would have translated to, "We have released the Ultimate Warriors. Pray for their success. Pray for the safety of all life in the cosmos." This message was intended to be a direct reference to the Metroids being created specifically to destroy the X-parasites, which are easily several times deadlier than any one Metroid. Now that we're done talking about all that, it's time to get to the cut content and unused assets. These are also going to be readily available in an Imgur album that I'll be linking in the video description. Again, I did not put any of these albums together, so thank the original creators because they are the ones who did that. The background you're seeing right now is a scrapped idea for the Area 5 background before the concept of it as a power distribution center was finalized. It was always going to be an underwater section, but what kind of underwater section was not really clear until late into the development. I gotta say, I really like this background, so I'll be keeping it on for the rest of the cut content discussion. Starting out simple, this is an alternate logo for the game which would have potentially been used in the title screen, but ultimately was scrapped due to not wanting to have the word Metroid directly in there in order to lessen the chances of any illegal action. Here's some unused HUD sprites. I gotta say, I really like the arrow here. It was planned to be displayed whenever an earthquake occurred, replacing the Metroid counter for a brief instance, and I'm kinda sad it wasn't used in the final game, although I understand why. Here's some sprites of blood. Now, it was originally intended to be used in areas where the Federation crew met their untimely demise, but they were ultimately scrapped in favor of keeping the game more in line with an official Nintendo product with keeping blood to a minimum. While I agree with the change overall, I've got to say that these are pretty gruesome and they'd work really well in any other sprite-based horror game. Here's some unused button icons. The idea here was to match the icons with whatever controller type was plugged into the game, but they were ultimately scrapped due to Game Maker not having the easiest time recognizing different controllers outside of, like, Xbox, which is a real shame. At first, I thought the words in the sprite sheet were intended to be used for planned keyboard and mouse controls, given the presence of the word click, but upon further thought, I'm pretty sure that these were just intended for directional inputs and for clicking in the joysticks, which makes more sense by far. Here's an early version of a sprite for an enemy we see in the final game. You know, those green wormy guys that burrow from the ceiling to the floor? Yeah, those annoying assholes. Not much to say about this one, although I really love how silly the sprite in the top right looks. It's great. This is an interesting one from Area 3. This sprite was originally intended to be part of a robot construction assembly line used for making Autodes. I don't think this was originally related to Skippy in any way, the player-controlled Autode that is, but the animation and scripting of having the game assemble an Autode from scratch was a lot of work for a small portion of the game, so the idea ended up being scrapped. Most of these assets you can see were reused for other parts of machinery in the factory area. Did you know that the diffusion beam from Other M was planned to make an appearance in this game? Yeah, neither did I until I started making this video actually. Its functionality would have been pretty much the same, making it so your charged shots would hit multiple enemies in an area, but the upgrade was pretty quickly scrapped when they realized it just wouldn't add all that much to the game. Personally, I would have liked to see it added to the game as a New Game Plus exclusive item similar to the beam combos. Now this one is pretty badass. It's the first draft for the tester boss in Area 4, and it looks dope as shit, but it ended up not being quite so flexible for the fight's design as Doc wanted, so it had to be scrapped in favor of a slightly more standard machine-type design in the final game. A damn shame, because I really like this design. This is a pretty weird one. This enemy was called Alpha Moto, and was originally supposed to be a mini-boss that would appear somewhere early on in the game and later planned to be in Area 5. Work on the sprites for it, however, was pushed back, and due to the effort involved in its sprite animations and not being a very interesting fight in the first place, it ended up getting cut. These scavenger bot sprites were intended to be almost a direct parallel to the bugs in the intro to Super Metroid, just sort of being a foreground object that ran away when Samus got close. They ended up getting cut due to making the environments they were planned to be in feel too busy. The mobile cache is pretty simple. It would have just been an object to destroy to get refills on health and ammunition, although this was scrapped due to enemies being pretty easy to farm and save points refill all your stuff anyways, so it wouldn't have even mattered. These hazard lights would have been used in the tower while the power was out in an attempt to add some creepy atmosphere, but in the end they got cut because they ended up detracting from the atmosphere they were trying to go for, and honestly I think that's for the best. These sprites were supposed to be used as a sort of load file animation, played when you, well, load a file and Samus is standing on the save point, similar to other 2D games in the series. They ended up getting scrapped due to the different design of the save stations in AM2R, and the animation just really didn't fit in. Here's a sprite of a door modeled after a Chozo statue. Not a whole lot to say about this one, although I really love the concept sprite in the top left. It's really good. Not a lot to say about this one either. It's a Chozo statue design. I'm pretty sure the poses were intended to be used for Terizo, although I'm not too sure what the front-facing sprite would have been for. Possibly just an alternate pose for a Chozo statue holding an important item. The egg sprite is another oddball, but I guess it could be related to Terizo's attack where it spits a bunch of bug-like creatures at you. I'm not too sure on this one. This one's pretty self-explanatory. It's just a first draft of the splash screen you see when you first turn on the game, the one that recommends that you use a controller. Nothing more complicated than that. This is a pretty simple one too. It's just an alternate version of Samus' ship. Both this and the sprite used in the final game were put on the forums and voted on for which design to use, and, well, the winner was not this one. Last but certainly not least is this animation for Samus. It didn't get very far in production as you can tell, only the outline was ever completed, but the idea was simply to have an alternate running animation for the speed booster. It ended up getting scrapped because it would have been way too time consuming for too little effect. Below that we can see a version of Samus wearing the fusion suit, which was planned as an unlockable costume after you beat the game. This got scrapped because it would have been too complicated to implement with how Samus' sprites are arranged in the game files. And that about does it for all the cut sprites. But we're not done with all of the cut content just yet. There are actually a few rooms present in the final game that can't be accessed via normal means, so we're going to take a brief look at those too. Again, you can find a link to these as well in an Imgur album in the video description. This one is pretty simple. It's an alternate room for obtaining the space jump, with the spikes on the left there preventing you from spider-balling your way out. Nothing stopping you from bomb jumping though if you were really determined, although that doesn't really matter since the room isn't even used in the final game. This is a room scrapped from Area 4. Not entirely sure what this one would have been, but considering the plasma beam is the only Chozo statue upgrade present in the final game, it's possible that this was an alternate room for obtaining it and you were originally required to get power bombs first. This room also could have been originally where the screw attack was before it was decided to be moved to Area 5, and I feel like this is probably the more likely scenario considering the screw attack was in the tower area in the original game. A room with 2 mounds of land and 3 pits of some sort. No idea what this was for, probably a scrapped section of the main tunnels if I had to guess. I think this room might be a variant of the lava and bubbles room seen in the mining facility leading to the Alpha Metroid in the final game, but with no objects present I can't really be too sure. This room is pretty huge, and it even has some of the pipe tiles used in Area 2, which might mean it was planned for usage there at some stage, but it could also possibly have been from an early version of Area 5 that would have used the same tile set. I have to really wonder where that path in the middle of the room was supposed to lead, if anywhere. Now this is a pretty easy one. It's an alternate save room for the genetics laboratory. See, in the original game, the 3 holes leading up into the main facility weren't blocked off and could be entered, with one of them leading to a health and missile refill, which I'm pretty sure this save station was supposed to replace. Similar deal for this one. My gut is telling me that this was supposed to be where you'd find the broken Chozo statue like in the original game, in the middle hole. Although, that room only existed in the original so you could get the ice beam in case you needed it to fight the Metroids, since you could only have one beam on Samus at any given time and they all overrode each other, which is obviously completely unnecessary in AM2R since all the beams stack. And lastly for the genetics laboratory, a scrapped entrance to the main area. Just like the other two, it's closer to the room from the original game. Not too much more to say about this one. This room was probably intended to be part of the GFS Thoth, since it's one of the only places in the game where an elevator actually shows up. Not much more to say about this one. Hey look, it's that part in Fusion where you have to break out of the elevator. Not entirely sure why this is here, and it uses the same tile set as the other room. It's possible that this was also part of the GFS Thoth, and that area might have originally been planned to have more Fusion references in its layout than we got in the final game. Now, I have no idea what's going on with this room. The main thing messing me up here is that weird grayscale thing on the right side. Maybe it was a barrier of some sort, or kind of static like we see in the gravity suit section in Area 5? I'm not too sure about this one. This is pretty clearly a test room, and heck, it's even labeled Test Room, used for the speed booster among other things by the looks of it. There's no visible blocks anywhere, though the collision data still exists. And hey look, there's the plasma beam. This is a really fascinating room, and I know exactly what it was used for. The file name is Trailer Room 5, and wouldn't you know it, this exact room shows up in an 8-year-old trailer for AM2R showcasing the space jump. The quality on this video is a little poor, but there's no doubt that it's the exact same room layout. Also present in that trailer is an area that does not appear at all in the final game with a completely unused background and sprite set. This could potentially be an old version of the post-explosion area where you originally got power bombs in the final game. Or it could have just been a scrapped area entirely. Either way, it's really fascinating. There's also another room in this trailer that's part of Area 5, and we in fact see this area in the final game. There's nothing much to say about this clip because it's just that room but with a different tile set. There are other trailers on Dr. M64's channel, but they're not quite as interesting as that one. They mostly just have some really old tile sets in use that look kinda bad, but they're worth a look if you are into that sort of thing. I'll leave a link in the description. So, there's one last piece of cut content to talk about, and it actually deals with a lot of the stuff that I just covered, and kind of confirms a lot of it. Back when the version 1.33 demo had first been released, there was a missing zone transition that would have the player falling into a black void infinitely, essentially leaving them completely unable to progress. However, due to this, it was possible to fly around using space jump and uncover every single square on the map, although the game would crash if you tried to go too low. I took the liberty of cobbling together what the map looked like in this version of the game, and there are some pretty interesting differences here. The one I feel deserves the most attention, however, is the GFS Thoth. It looks like at some point in development the Thoth was intended to be accessed from a section of Area 1, and you can see a fair few differences in how the map is laid out. Notably, the surface area was much smaller in this version. Other noteworthy part includes the genetics laboratory, where you can see, hey, all that stuff I was saying about the unused rooms? Totally true. And yeah, the part where you get power bombs in the final game cannot be viewed in this because if you go down too far, it crashes the game. Believe me, I tested this. Also, looking over at Area 5, we can see that the layout was completely different, with what looks like one of the major upgrades being located in the bottom left. Speaking of major upgrades, we can definitely see that there were two major upgrades also located in the tower area. One of these was definitely Screw Attack, and if I had to guess, it was where the Plasma Beam is in the final game. With the Plasma Beam potentially having been moved to where the Screw Attack was in the original game, it's weird. I could be wrong on this one though. And believe it or not, that about does it for all the cut content in AM2R, at least as far as I could find. Whew. That was pretty long-winded if I do say so myself. So yeah, this has been the AM2R bonus video. I hope it was worth the wait, and I do apologize for it taking so long, but it's been... Huh? What do you mean there's still more?